The dust hung heavy in the golden air, swirling in lazy spirals as the sun poured molten light over the wild Mustang showcase. A hush rippled through the crowd seated around the rugged, sun-beaten arena, their excitement fading into an anxious buzz. Children craned their necks. Parents gripped the wooden rails, shielding their eyes against the glare. Something was wrong. Everyone could feel it. The 6 Mustangs, proud, massive, unbroken in spirit despite their training, charged into the center of the arena, muscles rippling beneath their glossy coat. They moved with a feral power that was barely contained, every hoof strike sending a deep vibration through the dusty ground. They were supposed to perform a choreographed routine, a testament to human skill over untamed nature. But the plan had unraveled the moment the lead stallion, Thunder, tossed his head high, refusing the bit, and broke formation. The others followed, a river of raw instinct flooding the ring. And there, impossibly small against the thunder of hooves and chaos, stood a little girl. She wore a white dress so simple it looked ghostly against the churning dust. Her boots, too large and scuffed, gave her an awkward, fragile stance. Her hair, the color of autumn wheat, whipped around her face, half obscuring the intense, glassy green of her eyes. She did not move, did not scream. She merely stood there as 6 wild creatures surrounded her, their nostrils flaring, their eyes wide and gleaming with confusion and suppressed fear. Jack Turner, the man who had brought the horses here, felt his heart tear inside his chest. His hands, calloused from years of work with animals, fumbled over the fence rail. He knew these horses. He knew their moods, their tells. He also knew that if they panicked now, if one kicked or charged, it would all be over before he could reach her. "Sophie!" he tried to yell, but his voice cracked against the wall of noise. Dust burned his throat, and terror froze his legs in place. Sophie. 8 years old, and still a mystery wrapped in a body too thin for her age. She had come to him only 6 months earlier, a broken bird with clipped wings. An orphan. Her parents had died in a wreck. Horses were involved, people said, though no one spoke of the details. She hadn't uttered more than a handful of words since. Jack, never a man good with talk, had taken her in anyway. Because sometimes silence recognizes silence. From the first day, Sophie had gravitated toward the horses. She didn't approach them like other children did, with outstretched hands and excited squeals. She watched. Waited. She moved among them with the quiet surety of something elemental, something ancient. Jack had noticed but hadn't dared name it aloud, afraid it might break whatever fragile thread tethered her to this world. And now that thread hung suspended between life and death. The Mustangs circled her like a living tide, hooves kicking up clouds that blurred the outlines of their massive bodies. Thunder, the biggest and proudest, pawed the earth and threw his head back with a shrill scream that ripped through the air. The audience gasped as one. Trainers rushed forward, waving their arms, shouting commands that were swallowed by the roaring confusion. Sophie did not flinch. To Jack, it felt like the earth itself had paused, holding its breath. What was she doing? Why wasn't she running? He tried to climb over the fence, but hands grabbed him, pulling him back. "Don't," someone barked. "You'll spook them worse." The logic burned him, but they were right. Any sudden move could turn panic into disaster. Helpless, he watched, his vision swimming with dust and dread. The memory of a morning just a few weeks before flashed across his mind. Sophie sitting alone in the pasture, the horses grazing around her, unconcerned. He had watched from the porch, coffee cooling in his hand, as Thunder, who barely tolerated human touch, walked to her and nuzzled her shoulder like she was a member of his herd. The dust began to settle in the arena, as if nature itself wanted to see what would happen next. Sophie's small figure remained in the very center of the chaos. Her hands hung loosely at her sides. Her feet, dusty and scuffed, rooted to the earth. Then, slowly, she lifted her head. Her hair fell away from her face, revealing a calm so deep it made Jack's knees buckle. She lifted her hand, palm open, fingers slightly curled as if offering something unseen. Thunder froze. The other horses stumbled into abrupt stillness, their bodies taut with uncertainty. The crowd was utterly silent now. Somewhere, a flag snapped listlessly on its pole. Dust coated every surface, clung to eyelashes and lips, but no one dared move. No one dared even breathe too loudly. Sophie's hand remained extended, unwavering. Jack saw the tiniest tremor in her arm, but it was not fear, it was strength. A trembling act of courage that seemed far larger than her small frame could contain. Thunder lowered his head slowly, nostrils quivering. Jack could see the strain in the great animal's muscles, could feel the coiled tension threatening to erupt. But then, impossibly, Thunder bent his knee and sank down, bowing low before the little girl. The crowd exhaled as one living thing. One by one, the other 5 mustangs followed, dropping to their knees around Sophie in a rough, protective circle. Their massive bodies shielded her like living ramparts, heads bowed in submission or perhaps in reverence. It was not obedience. It was not training. It was something older, something raw and sacred. Jack wiped his eyes without meaning to. His heart swelled so painfully he thought it might break apart inside his chest. Sophie lowered her hand and, for a long moment, simply stood among them, the white of her dress stark against their dark, powerful bodies. Dust caught in the shafts of sunlight and hung in the air like a million golden spirit. In that moment, she looked less like a child and more like something born of the wild itself. Jack thought he could hear the very heartbeat of the earth, slow and heavy and steady. Someone near him whispered, "It's a miracle." But Jack knew better. Miracles were rare and flashy. This was something quieter. This was trust, ancient and true, born from a bond deeper than fear, deeper even than memory. The arena announcer, voice trembling, fumbled to regain control over the event. "Ladies and gentlemen, please stay calm, we're assessing the situation." His words were lost against the soft thud of horses shifting their weight, the occasional snort of warm breath rising into the dusty afternoon. Jack forced himself to breathe. He could feel the choice dangling in the space between moments. Rush in and break the spell, or trust that Sophie and the horses would find their own way out. He stayed where he was, gripping the rail so hard it bit into his skin. Finally, Sophie turned, brushing her hand lightly across Thunder's massive neck. The stallion sighed, a sound almost human in its softness. She walked, not hurried, not afraid, through the ring of mustangs. They rose as she passed, following her with their eyes, but they did not pursue her. She crossed the arena until she reached Jack. Her small, dust-streaked face tilted up to meet his. Her lips parted. For a heartbeat, he thought she might say something, but instead, she simply took his calloused hand in her tiny fingers and squeezed once, firmly. Then she let go and turned back to the arena. Jack felt something shift inside him, some locked door groaning open on its rusty. The tension from the arena still clung to the air long after the dust had settled. People moved slowly, speaking in hushed tones as if afraid that raising their voices might shatter something fragile and sacred left behind by Sophie and the mustangs. Jack stood with his arms folded tightly across his chest, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes glancing between him and the little girl who had, without a single word, tamed what no one else could. Sophie remained close to him, her small hand occasionally brushing against his side for reassurance. She didn't look at the crowd or acknowledge the trainers who scrambled to regain control of the situation. Her attention remained fixed on the mustangs, who now wandered calmly within the ring, as if the earlier chaos had been nothing but a distant memory. One by one, people began to leave, their faces etched with awe and confusion. Some muttered about magic, others about fate. Jack heard none of it. His mind was locked in a whirlpool of emotions, each one dragging him deeper into a truth he could no longer ignore. The mustangs had not simply obeyed Sophie. They had recognized something within her, something he didn't fully understand yet. And that recognition had changed everything. By the time the last visitor drifted away, the sun was dipping behind the mountains, casting the world in a deep, molten gold. Jack crouched down beside Sophie, dust swirling softly around them like smoke. "You scared me today, kiddo," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. Sophie's green eyes lifted to meet his, steady and unreadable. She said nothing, but Jack felt the weight of her gaze settle into him like a brand. It wasn't defiance or indifference he saw there, it was trust. A complete and unflinching trust that both terrified and humbled him. He ran a hand through his graying hair, searching for the right words. None came. Instead, he stood and offered his hand. Sophie took it without hesitation. Together, they walked back toward the stables where the Mustangs would be cared for overnight. Thunder followed a few steps behind, his massive frame moving with surprising gentleness. Jack glanced back and caught the stallion watching Sophie with an almost human intensity, and a shiver raced down his spine. Later, after the horses were fed and watered and the world had faded into deep blue twilight, Jack sat on the porch of his small, weathered house. The wood creaked beneath him, old and familiar. Beside him, Sophie swung her legs over the edge of the step, toes not quite touching the ground. The silence between them was companionable, stitched together with the soft sounds of crickets and the distant murmur of the river. Jack rubbed his hands together, feeling the grit of the day caught in the lines of his skin. He thought about the girl sitting beside him, the girl who had somehow done what no seasoned trainer, no celebrated horse whisperer had managed to do. He thought about the first time he'd seen her. The social worker had dropped her off with 2 garbage bags full of clothes and a stuffed rabbit missing one eye. She had stood on his porch, impossibly small and fragile, while the woman had explained in clinical, detached tones that Sophie had suffered significant trauma and might struggle with attachment. Jack hadn't needed the words. He had seen the walls she had built around herself, high and impenetrable. He had not expected to break through them. He hadn't even tried. Instead, he had given her space and time and the company of horses who, like her, understood what it meant to be wild and wary. Now he wondered if she had chosen him just as much as he had chosen her. "You know," Jack said finally, his voice threading through the stillness, "those Mustangs aren't like regular horses. They don't trust easy. They don't forgive easy, either." Sophie tilted her head slightly, listening. "They've seen too much bad from people. Takes something special to get through to them." The words hung there between them, heavy with meaning. Sophie reached down and plucked a blade of grass from the ground, twisting it between her fingers. The simple, thoughtless motion was a child's gesture, but there was a gravity to it that belied her years. Jack sighed and leaned back against the railing, staring up at the blanket of stars unfurling overhead. "I reckon you're something special too," he said, barely more than a whisper. A long moment passed, and then, to his astonishment, Sophie spoke. "They're scared," she said, her voice so soft he barely caught it. Jack turned his head sharply to look at her, but she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the porch, where the shapes of the stables loomed against the horizon. "They're not mean. They're just scared," she said again, with a certainty that sent a ripple through Jack's chest. He swallowed hard, emotion knotting in his throat. "You're right," he managed. The words seemed to open something in her. She spoke again, still soft, still tentative, as if testing the air for safety. "When I was in the car, when it happened, the horses ran in front of us. Daddy tried to stop, but he couldn't." Her voice cracked, and Jack felt the world narrow down to the two of them, suspended between earth and sky. "I saw one of them," she whispered. "It looked right at me." Jack didn't move. He didn't dare. "It wasn't their fault," she said fiercely, small fists clenching around the blade of grass. "No, honey," Jack said, his voice breaking. "It wasn't." Sophie wiped her face with the back of her hand, stubbornly brushing away the tears. She looked so small, so fierce, so heartbreakingly brave that Jack thought his heart might tear in two. He reached over and rested his hand lightly on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. "They're scared," she repeated, softer now. "But they still listen." Jack nodded, though she wasn't looking at him. They listen because you speak the language they remember, he said, more to himself than to her. Above them, a shooting star cut a silver wound across the sky. Sophie leaned against his side, just a little, and Jack closed his eyes against the sudden burning there. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know how to mend all the broken pieces scattered across Sophie's life. But he knew this. They would find a way forward together, step by tentative step. In the dark, Thunder let out a low, rumbling nicker from the stables, as if echoing the promise silently forged between the man, the girl, and the wildness that bound them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, and new reckonings. But tonight, beneath a sky stitched with stars, they had found something that would carry them through the storms to come. Trust. And trust, Jack thought, was stronger than any fence, any bit, any wall built from pain. The night deepened around them, and Jack felt Sophie's small head tip against his arm. Her breathing slowed, evening into the soft rhythms of sleep. He stayed there, unmoving, watching the dark horizon where the mustangs slept, where hope still waited quietly to be claimed. And deep inside, Jack felt it, a stirring as wild and pure as the creatures they both loved. The beginning of something new. Something worth fighting for. Morning broke with a gentle hush, the world bathed in a soft amber glow. Jack stirred on the porch, stiff from sleeping upright, his arm still curled protectively around Sophie's small form. She was already awake, her green eyes wide and solemn, gazing out toward the stables where the mustangs were beginning to stir. A chorus of soft nickers and the shuffle of hooves drifted through the cool morning air. Jack rubbed his neck, trying to work the stiffness out of his muscles, and followed Sophie's gaze. Thunder stood near the gate, his powerful silhouette outlined against the pale light, waiting. It wasn't just instinct or coincidence. Jack knew it now. The stallion was waiting for her. Sophie rose without a word, brushing dust from her jeans, her little face set with quiet determination. Jack hesitated, then rose too, following her as she walked barefoot across the dew-slicked grass toward the corral. The morning chill bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His heart thudded in his chest, a slow, heavy beat of both fear and wonder. At the gate, Thunder whickered softly, dipping his great head low enough that Sophie could reach out and rest her hand on the bridge of his nose. Jack held his breath. Thunder stood completely still, the tension that had once coiled in every muscle now gone, replaced by something astonishing: trust. Around them, the other mustangs edged closer, drawn in by some invisible thread. Chestnut, Raven, Storm, Willow, and Dusty, all of them moved with cautious steps, their sharp eyes locked on the little girl who had unraveled the fear and fury that had once defined them. Sophie turned to Jack, her expression a question without words. Jack swallowed hard, feeling the enormity of the choice laid before him. His entire life had been built on respecting the wildness in creatures like these. He had never forced them, never broken their spirit. But this was different. This was an invitation. He gave a slow nod. Without hesitation, Sophie lifted the latch and swung the gate wide. The mustangs stepped forward, their hooves whispering against the ground. They formed a loose circle around Sophie, their bodies taut but unthreatening. Jack's hands curled into fists at his sides, every instinct screaming to move, to protect her, but he stayed rooted to the spot, trusting because she trusted. Then Sophie did something that made Jack's heart stop. She closed her eyes. No words. No commands. Just pure, unguarded faith. The mustangs shifted, uncertain, their ears flicking. Thunder lowered his head first, brushing his muzzle against her shoulder with infinite gentleness. One by one, the others followed, touching her lightly with their noses, as if recognizing her as one of their own. Jack blinked against the sting in his eyes. He knew he was witnessing something rare and precious, something few would ever understand. Time seemed to suspend itself, holding them all in a fragile, golden bubble. But fragile things can shatter quickly. A loud bang cracked the air like a whip. Sophie flinched and the mustangs bolted back, hooves pounding the earth in panic. Thunder reared, his massive body a sudden tower of raw power. Jack surged forward, instincts overriding reason, but before he could reach her, Sophie stood firm, her small body radiating a calm so profound it seemed to anchor the world around her. Thunder landed heavily, snorting and tossing his head, but his wild eyes locked onto Sophie's steady gaze. He stilled, muscles trembling, nostrils flaring. Jack whipped his head around, searching for the source of the noise. Down the road, a rusted pickup rattled toward them, its engine coughing and sputtering. Behind the wheel sat Wade Jensen, the owner of the neighboring ranch, a man known for his quick temper and cruel hand with animals. Wade leaned out the window, a sneer twisting his weathered face. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice loud enough to carry. "Looks like you've got yourself a little sideshow, Jack." Jack's blood boiled. He moved protectively toward Sophie, placing himself between her and the truck. "You've got no business here, Wade," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Wade laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Just came to see the miracle everyone's been jawing about. Girl's got him eating outta her hand, huh? Maybe I oughta buy her off ya. Bet she'd fetch a good price." Jack's fists tightened. He took a step forward, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. Sophie slipped her hand into his, her fingers small but strong. Jack glanced down, saw the determination burning in her eyes, and felt the rage within him cool into something harder, sharper. "She's not for sale," Jack said, his voice like granite. Wade's smile twisted into a scowl. He spat out the window, the glob landing in the dust. "You'll regret it, old man," he growled, gunning the engine and roaring off down the road in a cloud of grit and malice. Jack stood there for a long moment, heart hammering, until the truck was nothing more than a memory on the horizon. The Mustang slowly edged back toward Sophie, drawn by the gravity she seemed to carry within her. Thunder approached first, his massive body blocking Jack's view for a moment. When he shifted aside, Jack saw Sophie's hand resting once again on the stallion's broad forehead, her face calm and unafraid. Jack exhaled shakily. They would have to be careful now. Wade Jensen wasn't a man to forget a slight, and Jack had no illusions about how far he might go if he thought he could profit from the Mustangs, or Sophie. As the sun climbed higher, Jack led Sophie and the Mustangs back into the larger pasture where they could roam freely. The land stretched out before them, wide and wild, a tapestry of golden grasses and rolling hills. It wasn't fenced, not entirely. The Mustangs could run if they chose. But they didn't. They stayed close, their movements gentle, watchful. Sophie moved among them with an ease that Jack could hardly believe, her small hands brushing against flanks and shoulders, her laughter bubbling up like spring water when one of the younger Maras nudged her playfully. Watching her, Jack felt something inside him begin to heal, a wound he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying for years. The loss of family, the loneliness, the slow erosion of dreams, it all seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet, steadfast hope. That night, after chores were done and the stars once again blanketed the sky, Jack and Sophie sat together on the porch, a quilt wrapped around their shoulders. Jack told her about the Mustangs, how they had come from wild herds driven off the plains, how they had fought to survive in a world that wanted to tame or destroy them. He spoke of freedom, of spirit, of resilience. Sophie listened, her eyes shining in the firelight, absorbing every word. When he finished, she said softly, "They don't need to be tamed." Jack nodded, feeling tears prick the corners of his eyes. "No, sweetheart. They don't. They just need someone to believe in them." The simplicity and truth of her words left him speechless. He pulled her close, feeling the fragile strength of her body, the fierce heart that beat within it. Tomorrow would bring more challenges. Wade Jensen would not let go of his grudge easily. The world was still full of people who saw wildness as something to be conquered rather than cherished. But Jack knew now that they would face it together. Man, girl, and Mustangs, all stitched together by bonds stronger than fear. Hope shimmered in the darkness, a thread of silver light leading them forward. And this time, The next morning came with an unnatural stillness, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Jack woke early, the air sharp against his skin, a feeling of unease gnawing at his gut. Sophie still slept soundly curled up on the old cot inside the house, her hand loosely gripping the corner of the quilt. Jack stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, then turned and headed outside, boots crunching over the frost-hardened ground. The mustangs were already gathered near the pasture's edge, their breath misting in the cold air. Thunder stood a few steps ahead of the others, his ears pricked, body tense. Jack's instincts flared. Something wasn't right. He moved quickly, his eyes sweeping the horizon. At first, everything appeared normal, the same rolling hills, the same threadbare fence lines, but then he spotted it, a dark smudge against the pale morning sky. Smoke. Rising from the far woods, too close to the Old West pasture for comfort. Jack's heart thudded painfully against his ribs. Wade Jensen. Without a second thought, he sprinted back toward the house, shoving open the door so hard it banged against the wall. Sophie sat up, startled, her hair a wild halo around her head. "Come on, kiddo. We need to move," Jack said, grabbing coats from the hook and tossing hers to her. "What's happening?" she asked, struggling into the heavy jacket. Jack didn't want to scare her, but there was no time for gentle truths. "Someone's trying to drive the mustangs off, or worse." Fear flickered across her face, but she pushed it down quickly, nodding. Together they ran for the barn, Jack saddling one of his old ranch horses with practiced speed. He lifted Sophie into the saddle without hesitation. "You'll ride with me. Stay low, hold tight." She did as she was told, her arms wrapping around his waist. Jack spurred the horse into a gallop, the wind tearing at them as they raced toward the smoke. As they crested the hill, Jack saw the full extent of the situation. A fire had been set along the brush line, flames licking greedily at the dry undergrowth. Worse, several men, Wade's hired hands, were moving around the perimeter, shouting and waving tarps, trying to spook the mustangs into a corral truck parked nearby. Jack's blood ran cold. They weren't just trying to steal them. They were driving them into a trap. Sophie tightened her hold around him. "We have to stop them," she whispered fiercely against his back. Jack nodded grimly. He had no plan, no real strategy, just a deep, burning need to protect what mattered. He rode hard toward the chaos, shouting to draw the men's attention. Several turned, startled, giving him a precious few seconds. Jack veered off, guiding his horse into the thick of the herd, urging the mustangs away from the growing wall of smoke. Thunder spotted him first, tossing his great head and letting out a piercing scream. The other mustangs responded, surging after Jack's lead. But the fire was spreading faster than he had expected. Already smoke stung Jack's eyes, and embers drifted dangerously close to their path. Sophie coughed against his jacket. "Jack, the horses!" He knew. He felt it. If they didn't find a way to push the herd past the firebreak soon, they'd be trapped. That's when he saw it, a narrow gap between two rocks, leading down into a dry riverbed. It was risky. The footing would be treacherous, but it was their only chance. Jack leaned low over his horse's neck, guiding them toward the gap. Thunder saw too, rallying the herd behind him. Dust and smoke churned around them as they plunged into the ravine, the sound of hooves thundering against stone filling the air. Behind them, Wade cursed loudly, but he didn't follow. Jack allowed himself a brief, grim smile. Wade wasn't brave enough to risk his neck chasing them through dangerous ground. They rode hard, the riverbed twisting and climbing, the mustangs following Jack's lead with an almost supernatural understanding. Sophie clung to him, silent now, her trust absolute. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they emerged into open pasture miles from the fire. Jack pulled the horse to a trembling halt, letting the mustangs fan out around them. Thunder circled back, nuzzling Sophie as if to make sure she was unharmed. Jack slid from the saddle and lifted Sophie down, holding her tight for a moment before setting her on her feet. She looked up at him, her face smudged with smoke, her eyes fierce. "We saved them." Jack knelt in front of her, gripping her shoulders. "You were brave, Sophie. Braver than most grown men I know." She smiled, a real, radiant smile, and for a moment, Jack forgot the danger, the fire, the men they had left behind. But reality quickly reasserted itself. They couldn't stay here. Wade wouldn't give up so easily. If anything, today's failure would only make him more desperate. Jack stood, scanning the horizon. They needed a plan. Something more permanent. "We're going to have to move them," he said quietly. "Somewhere Wade can't reach." Sophie frowned. "Where?" Jack thought hard. There was a canyon deep in the national forest, a protected area where wild horses were sometimes relocated. It was rough, remote, and the trip would be dangerous, but it might be their only chance. He explained the plan to Sophie, who listened intently, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Will Thunder and the others understand?" she asked when he finished. Jack looked at the Mustangs, at the way they lingered near Sophie, waiting for her signal. "I think they already do," he said. They spent the next few hours gathering supplies, water, feed, what little they could carry. Jack hated the thought of leaving the ranch behind, but it was a small price to pay compared to losing the Mustangs, or Sophie. As they prepared to leave, Jack caught sight of something in the distance, a cloud of dust rising against the setting sun. Wade. He was coming back, and this time, he wasn't alone. Multiple trucks barreled down the dirt road, filled with men and equipment. Jack's heart sank. They had minutes at best. He whistled sharply, signaling Thunder. The stallion's head snapped up, ears swiveling toward the danger. Jack swung Sophie onto the horse's back and climbed up behind her, pressing his heels into the gelding's sides.